Hello YouTube. The Elder Scrolls universe is full of stories of ancient Tamriel, set in time periods that we can't even dream of playing in. One of the most interesting periods, in my opinion, is the time when Tamriel was still ruled by the elves, with several elven kingdoms and empires ruling over lands which in modern day Tamriel are all ruled over by the races of human. In this day and age, Cyrodiil was controlled by the Ayleid Empire, an elven empire constituted of many smaller independent Ayleid elven kingdoms, and it just so happens that the story of one of these kingdoms and its ruler, the ancient Ayleid Sorcerer King Celemariel Lightbringer, is central to the plot of the nowadays pretty obscure Elder Scrolls mobile game, The Elder Scrolls Blades, a game which I cannot recommend playing in this day and age, although this is why I will tell you the story of its main antagonist, Celemariel Lightbringer, which is quite interesting in this video, after the intro. So, the Ayleid Empire, a loose confederacy of Ayleid kingdoms which were all kinda bound to a single big Ayleid sphere of influence, which consisted mostly of Cyrodiil but also some parts of Hammerfell, Valenwood and Blackmarsh. For a full history recap of the empire and its legacy, you can watch my video on the Ayleid Empire, which is in the description. But what's important to know for this video is that the Ayleid civilization had controlled the Tamrielic heartland for millennia, in the Meretic era and in the early First era. Their empire was big and prosperous, and if you were an Ayleid, life must have been pretty swell. Although if you were any of the other races of Tamriel, be it beast race or human, you were most likely a slave in the empire, and depending on where you were in the empire, life really wasn't very swell, as your forced labor fueled the Ayleid empire's economy. Although, as we talked about in the video on the Ayleid Empire, there came a point where the empire slowly but surely would start to lose much of its unity, before it basically erupted into an Ayleid Empire civil war called the Narfinsal Schism, a more than 200-year-long period, likely even longer, which was marked by civil war and conflicts between the kingdoms of the Ayleid Empire. The essence of this large-scale civil war was a religious conflict between the kingdoms of Ayleids who worshipped the Aedra, the gods which helped create the mortal plane, many of which can be seen in the modern-day divine pantheons like Mara and the Bella, and on the other hand were the Daedra worshipping kingdoms, which primarily worshipped the Daedra and who had started to summon Daedra for everything, summoning armies and servants alike. Eventually, this series of conflicts, called the Narfinsal Schism, was won by the Daedra-worshipping Ayleids, when after a final battle in southeastern Cyrodiil at the kingdom of Wendelbeck, the organized resistance against Daedra worship basically completely ceased in Cyrodiil. Now, the end of this period of conflict came in the year 198 of the First Era, and the prevailing of Daedra worship and weakening of the Empire after centuries of civil war made it so that the human and other slaves in the Empire got treated harsher and eventually led them to stand up against their masters in less than 50 years' time after the end of the Narfinsal Schism, in the Alessian Slave Rebellion, just to give you a bit of a timescale idea. Now, what's important to remember is that the Narfinsal Schism seemingly wasn't really like an organized civil war as far as we know. It was more of a long drawn out series of conflicts in which the Daedra worshipping kingdoms just slowly got the upper hand. It was not like the Skyrim Civil War with two parties having the objective of conquering the entire province, rather it was a long period with a lot of civil conflicts between different independent Ayleid kingdoms of the Empire. At least that's what I've been able to gather on the period. Now, today's story, the story of Celemariel Lightbringer, seems to have taken place during the Narfinsal Schism, as one of the many conflicts making up the at least 2 centuries of civil war in the Ayleid Empire, although this was apparently pretty early on in the schism, from what I've been able to gather. You see, back in the early First Era, there was an Ayleid Sorcerer King who was dubbed Celemaril Lightbringer. He ruled over an Ayleid kingdom somewhere in the south of Cyrodiil in the early First Era. Likely during the early parts of the Narfinsal Schism, or maybe even starting a little bit before that. And our town in the Elder Scrolls Blades was at one point part of this kingdom. Not many records of his rule remain, but what we can reasonably say is that Celemaril, for all terms and purposes, seems to have been a king of one of the Daedra worshipping kingdoms during the Narfinsal Schism. While he isn't explicitly linked to Daedra worship in the game, he was an avid necromancer, which is a magical art in the godly domain of the Daedra prince Molag Bal, and we know that his opponents, which we will talk about in a bit, were Daedra worshippers, so yeah, I feel confident linking him to that side of the schism. Now, at some point during Celemariel's rule, it's said that his rule became tyrannic, and not just that, he started to rely ever more on necromancy to strengthen his power, raising armies of the undead to fight for him and serve him. In his later rule, of which records remain, he was apparently obsessed with becoming more powerful and raising more and more undead armies to eventually launch a conquest of other, likely neighboring Daedra worshipping, Ayleid kingdoms, with, according to some sources, the ultimate aim to apparently eventually conquer or destroy all of Tamriel. At least that's what the scholars are able to find out about him several millennia after his rule ended. Because eventually his tyrannical rule did end. You see, when he tried to conquer the other Ayleid kingdoms and expand his tyranny, his own brother, the Daedra worshipping Prince Valentis, managed to unite many of his enemies against him and create an alliance of several Ayleid kings, which with their armies then fought Celemariel and his undead hordes. In fact, not only was Prince Valentis able to unite several of Celemariel's rival kingdoms against him, he even managed to convince a dragon, the dragon Shulkanag, who lived in southern Cyrodiil, to join the fight against his brother Celemariel. Remember that this is a time period long before the Akaviri came to Tamriel and created the Dragon Guards, which later became the Blades, who hunted down most of Tamriel's dragons in the late First Era. In the early First Era, dragons, while relatively rare, were still quite active on Tamriel, and this one, Shulkanag, after Valentis' plea, decided to join the fight against his necromancer brother Celemariel, whose nickname, the Lightbringer, was no longer very relevant after starting to invade the other Ayleid kingdoms with his undead hordes. However, the allied kingdoms under Valentis' leadership and the help of the dragon Shulkanag were eventually able to defeat Celemariel's undead hordes and kill the Sorcerer King himself, and all was right with the world. But oh no, what a twist. You see, it turned out that Celemariel, ever the conniving necromancer, had rendered himself immortal by turning himself into an extremely powerful form of lich. Now, there's many different types of liches on Tamriel, and there's much subtlety to their specific creation. Basically, it seems that almost every lich is a little bit different, with some being quite easily killed and others effectively invincible, and yet others being invincible until an object, which their soul is somehow tethered to, is destroyed, but liches are their own can of worms. But what kind Celemariel turned himself into, we don't rightly know, but what we do know is that he was somehow linking himself magically to his crown in some way, although either Valentis and his allies weren't able to destroy said crown, or perhaps destroying the crown wouldn't have helped in some way. We really just don't know, because in the end what would happen is that Valentis, while wearing his brother's crown, which was linked to the Lich in some way, had to speak a very specific binding incantation with the help of an Elder Scroll and several extremely powerful Varla stones inside a marble statue. This ritual magically bound Celemariel to a tomb, never to escape again, meaning that now he was most definitely forever dealt with, at least as far as Valentis and his allies were concerned, as peace now returned to the realm. In the aftermath of the conflict, Valentis would take Celemariel's place as ruler, and he and the other Ayleid allies that he had would wipe Celemariel from the official Ayleid histories, something which back then was apparently quite commonplace for enemies. Valentis would apparently rule the kingdom for quite some years until his death, and it would only be after his death, as the conflicts in the Narfinsul Schism permanently turned against the Daedra worshipping Ayleids apparently, that the kingdom would eventually fall and be abandoned, or perhaps that happened during the Alessian Slave Rebellion. To be fair, we literally know nothing of the post-Valentis period, so that's all speculation. But what we do know is that in typical Elder Scrolls fashion, the evil, which would have to be sealed for eternity, really just wasn't sealed for eternity, because when in the year 180 of the 4th era, 5 years after the Great War in Cyrodiil, some mercenaries tasked with tax collection came to the town of Rivercrest, which was built on top of Celemariel and Valentis' old kingdom, and is also the official name of the town in which the Elder Scrolls Blades takes place in. The town wasn't able and willing to pay the taxes, and so, to teach the town a lesson, the mercenaries destroyed the big marble Ayleid statue in the center of town. And it just so happens that this statue contained the Varla stones and the Elder Scroll used to bind Celemariel. which set him free once again to necromance his way to building an undead army to overrun Tamriel. And as soon as he escaped, that's basically what he started doing. During our playtime in the Elder Scrolls Blades, we tried to stop him from building his army, and we tried to track him down and once more bind him to his tomb, uncovering the secrets of Celemaril and Valentis and finding Celemariel's ancient crown, talking to the dragon Shulkanag and talking to Valentis' ghost, and eventually at the end of the main story, fighting Celemariel himself in lich form before binding him once more to his tomb. I have to say that despite the game not being the greatest, I always enjoyed the Elder Scrolls Blade story for what it was, and it was nice being able to talk about it again. Although I do wish that we had more lore on Celemariel himself and his early rule, but hey, what can you expect of a mobile game? Although this video mostly came about because I did some research into the Elder Scrolls Blades' story, and I always was kind of confused where Celemariel and Valentis fit in, but then something happened. I found out that Valentis basically worships the Aedra, and it suddenly all made sense that their entire conflict was most likely part of the Narvisal Schism, which was just super interesting to me and sparked me to make this video. Anyway, that being said, that's about all I can say about King Celemaril Lightbringer and his brother Valentis, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this video and managed to learn something new about the Elder Scrolls lore. And if you did, please give the video a like, and one of those hype things would be greatly appreciated, and you would help the channel out a lot. And now, all that remains for me to be done is to vocally thank my top Patreon supporters. Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, King Chris 20, Volkior Vargonia, RB Dash, Polycom, Baradermas, Lexicon, Sword of Bushido, Rakai, Spaceman, Ranger, and James Lynch. It's thanks to these people and all the others on screen who are my lovely Patreon supporters and YouTube members that this channel stays alive and why I can take off time in my job to even make these Elder Scrolls lore videos. So, huge thanks to them. Links are in the description if you want to join them and see your name on screen right now. With that being said, I will see all of you in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Bye bye.